Oh, that's neat. It has the consent thing.
Yes.
That's cool. That is very important. I learned. Okay.
Well, thanks for that nice photo of Tompkins Hall.
Yes, we wanted to kind of acknowledge the history and the legacy that we're tapping into, and you know, it's one of those things you look at the details and just all of the kind of the thought and care that went into putting this building together, and so we wanted to kind of honor and acknowledge it. So glad you appreciate it.
Yeah, it was I think it reopened maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, I want to say, and it went through a reconstruction. So literally everything got rebuilt except for the exterior shell, including the dome.
Oh, including the dome, okay.
Yeah, including the dome. And it was kind of interesting because it had like this scaffolding, like metal scaffolding around the whole exterior to keep the walls from caving in. And at the bottom of it, they had even done the foundation was done in brick. So there are these layers of brick that they had used for the actual foundation. It was pretty amazing to see it. Yeah, and this goes down at least another level or so below the lowest grade point. It is pretty amazing. So we'll go ahead and let Killian get started. So class, good afternoon to everybody again. As we mentioned before, we'd like you to just place your name in the chat. That way I can try to keep track of attendance for today. We want you to take notes, and because you're going to get a little assignment after the class today on some of the items that were presented and the presenters. And we want you to think of a question that you can include in the chat. I'd like you to maybe, as the conversation is going, if you could type a question for us for the presenters. And at certain points, we may have a break, or maybe toward the end, we can try to field as many of your questions as we can. But please do so. Please feel free to do so. So we want to welcome several guests with us today. They are part of what they call Dark Matter University. And they've collaborated with us here at Tuskegee, principally led by Professor Justin Moore, who I'm collaborating with on a different course from Columbia University. And I think there are a few others, or at least one other individual who's also at Columbia. And I'm going to let him introduce himself, and I'll let the other presenters today introduce themselves. We wanted to kind of kick this off so that you get a chance to see all of them. And then what's going to happen is that they individually will come back and provide more in-depth presentations for us for several series of classes. So very happy to have them involved with us this semester. So I'll turn it over to you guys. And we have about maybe about 45, 50 minutes for the run time. And we'll just kind of use the time as best we can. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Fluker, and really happy to be here as a part of the Dark Matter University team and to share some of our work as people working in architecture, design, built environment, construction, and development, to share just some of our career paths and experiences with all of you. As mentioned, we have 5 of us here on the call, or on the meeting. We're going to be introducing sort of a taste of our work, and happy to kind of start a dialogue and a conversation across you know, the semester with each of you. So these are the 5, and we'll all do sort of self-introduction. So Vanessa, Jerome, Jennifer, Killian, and myself, all working in our own firms and practices and in different modes of architecture, design, and construction. But as Professor Fluker mentioned, we're part of Dark Matter University. So this is an initiative that grew out of all of the conversations and actions looking at the kind of the social situation that we all find ourselves within between the pandemic and the protests for Black Lives Matter, really looking at the field of architecture, design, and construction to see how we reinvent that. So Dark Matter University is an anti-racist design justice school, collectively seeking radical transformation of education and practice toward a just future. So you all are just now starting your education and kind of exposure to architecture and design and construction. But you'll find very quickly that all of the sort of larger issues of society that kind of impact Black people, communities of color, really are embedded in so many of the things that we learn in our design education and then ultimately in professional practice. And so with Dark Matter University, we're this sort of collective of architects and designers and educators from across the country that are working together to advance the same for how do we have a more justice-focused approach to education. So this is the vision of this collective that you all are now connected to. It says that we cannot survive and thrive without immediate change toward an anti-racist model of design education and practice. Existing systems have not been able to transform away from centering and advancing whiteness through their reliance on an implied, dominant, and racialized subject and audience, right? This is the unbearable whiteness that we often are dealing with in our professional practices. The impacts of that centering are widespread and can be felt in the inequities that global extraction, racial capitalism, and colonialism have created. So these are these kind of big issues and challenges that we're all facing and working on. But the sort of vision continues and says that the earth and the majority of its people have suffered tremendous harm as a result. Collective liberation can not only occur within the confines of individual institutions. So Dark Matter University is founded to work inside and outside of existing systems to challenge, inform, and reshape our present world toward a better future. So that's why we're all here with you. We're in this kind of new space that's inside and outside of institutions, kind of working between different boundaries to kind of work together to develop new ways to think about our field and how we practice and collaborate. And so the ways that we're doing this is to create this sort of network of people that are operating under some principles and new ways of working. So we work to create 1, new forms of knowledge and knowledge production, 2, new forms of institutions and power, and embedded in that kind of rebalancing some of the inequities. Creating new forms of collectivity and practice. So again, all of us being in this space together here is a form of that. Creating new forms of community and culture, and finally, developing new forms of design. And so with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Vanessa. So we're all gonna do very short 5 slides, 5-minute presentations for each of us, and then we'll transition over to questions. So Vanessa, take it away.
Great, thank you. So greetings everybody. I'm very excited to be joining you today and sharing my career story with you. My name is Vanessa Alicea Chuki, and I'm a founding principal of Naivar Architecture, which is a New York City-based collaborative architecture practice that's focused on building community and equity through design. So I'm a Nuyorican, which is a Puerto Rican born and raised in New York. And I also happen to spend my summers in Puerto Rico on a farm in a house built by my grandfather and my uncle, who's also an architect. I'll talk a little bit about how this impacted my career path later on. In addition to being a registered architect in New York State, I'm also an educator and have taught at the City College of New York, where I'm an alum. I'm also president of the CCNY Architecture Alumni Group, and been really committed to design justice. And hold on one second, I'm trying to get my notes together. And I've been very active over the last 15 years with the American Institute of Architects, which is the AIA, and also the New York chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects, which is NOMA. So while my career path over the last 15 years has been pretty traditional, after Hurricane Maria, I have reprioritized my work to really focus on community-based design and how we can connect design justice with sustainability and resilience. I will actually be going back to graduate school starting Wednesday to get my master's in urban policy and leadership at Hunter College of New York, and I'm looking forward to how this will impact my practice. So Killian, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is a little bit of sort of my timeline, right? I still am trying to figure out the right way of mapping this out, but it's very linear right now. So I was able to study architecture in high school. I went to Brooklyn Technical High School, which is a specialized high school in New York City, which means I never went to sort of my local school. My last 2 years in high school, we had an opportunity to select a major, and I chose architecture. From there, I went to the City College of New York, which is located in Harlem. I graduated in 2005. After sort of, while I was in school, I had the opportunity to get a job with a professor of mine whose name was Gary McNeil. Gary McNeil coordinated the 5th year thesis project for the undergraduate program, but he also taught he also taught architectural management, which is something that I am actually teaching now, sort of fast forward like 15, 17 years later. He was a Black architect. His office was in Harlem. It was a small office. It was 5 or 6 of us, and we learned a little bit about everything. I actually think everything I learned about architecture and about firms, I learned in that small office. He ran it like a teaching practice, right? So everything that happened, any letters that came in, any contracts that were signed, he would constantly ask us like, why aren't you signing? Why shouldn't I sign this contract? And he was very open with all of the sort of the ways the firm functioned. So it was a really great experience, but it was small, and I had sort of limited access to the types of projects I could get or be working on. So I was working on a lot of townhome renovations. So in 2007, this is sort of 2 years after graduation, I had finished all my experience requirements for licensure. And I was thinking about sort of what was next for me. And so I decided to go to a little bit of a larger firm. I went to Datner Architects. So Datner Architects, I ended up staying there for 11 years. And I became an associate there. I worked on a really great sort of portfolio of projects over the course of that time. I actually, my mom is a librarian, and she worked in the library that Datner Architects designed. So it used to be funny because my mom was like the biggest fan of Datner Architects because she actually worked in one of the libraries that they had designed. But in 2018, a few things happened. I got married, and I also, Hurricane Maria happened. And in the process of sort of planning my wedding and also thinking about sort of what was next, the home and the space that I grew up in Puerto Rico was destroyed through the hurricane. And there was a lot of family members that I wasn't able to reach out to or hear from. And so I really sort of started looking at sort of what do I do next? And that's when I started my practice. And I'm very interested as sort of as a native New Yorker, I've been seeing how all these projects that are being built around the city I grew up in are really impacting neighborhoods, not always in the best way. And so I'm trying to figure out sort of what my role is as an architect to be able to sort of influence what's happening. I also started to have a problem working on some of the projects because I didn't really agree that they should be happening. So that's sort of a little bit about my career path. If you can go to the next slide. So I worked on a few projects. The most notable one I think that I've loved is Via Verde. It was a sustainable affordable housing project in the South Bronx. I'll talk more about that later. So if you can go to the next. So these are just snapshots. Again, a lot of affordable housing, schools, some community centers, and also a little bit of historic preservation, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide. Very interested in issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Max Bond is somebody who, J. Max Bond Jr. is somebody who was formerly a dean at City College of New York, and he was a sort of Black architect who was very instrumental in Harlem and in the AIA and in NOMA. And he's been somebody who I really think was sort of a champion for supporting the next generation of architects. And he's somebody that I really admire and has been instrumental in some of how some of where I've been getting involved in different areas, specifically related to diversity and inclusion. If you can go to the next slide. I think this is the last slide. So I have a sort of roadshow thing that I've done with two other young women, one from Haiti and one from Dominica, and we've been talking about sort of how do we use our sort of role as architects to look back at sort of some of the devastation that's happening in our sort of home countries, and see how we can sort of like use design to sort of harness some of the culture that already exists in our communities and sort of the resilience that's already there, but how we can sort of use our voice as designers and as architects to help really make communities stronger. So these are just some shots of me in Puerto Rico, but all at sort of different phases of my life. But the last one on the bottom is something that's been really important to me because this is one of my mentees. She's a student at City College, and the City College had a set of students go down right after the hurricane to help rebuild. And I think the ability to be part of some of these rebuilding efforts is so important in so many ways. These students had opportunities to really work with local groups, and they came back just super inspired, right? And the ability to sort of get yourself a little dirty, I think is really powerful to sort of implementing change. So with that, I'm done.
Great. All right, I guess I'm up. Hi, everybody. My name is Jerome Haven. By the way, Vanessa, that was awesome. You rock. I learned some things about you. It's also a small world, and it's funny, like all the little weird connections that there are between us, and also very different backgrounds. Yeah, my name's Jerome. I am most of the time in Harlem, New York, is where I live and have my office. I'm not there now. I'm in an undisclosed location, but I'm in New York State. And I have a practice that is a partnership. It's called Brandt Hayford, which I run with my design partner, business partner, Brandt Knapp. It's a woman. And so the first half of the practice name is her first name, and the second half is my last name, which we feel kind of maybe sounds like one person or a strange, weird hybrid name, which is the point. And I also am in academia and involved in activism and advocacy as well. And I would say that in some ways, my practice is definitely all of those things. And I think these days, the line between kind of what I'm doing on any given day in any one of those spheres and even outside of all three of those spheres is really, I consider, kind of my practice. So if you go to the next slide. So just starting from the beginning, I'm originally from Ohio, not too far from where Killian is now. Killian is up there on the lake in Cleveland, but I grew up in the smaller city to the south, Akron, Ohio. You can see a photo of my twin brother and I there. Grew up in a mixed racial environment and background, parentage, and a single parent household with not really an architecture background in my family. So I did not come to architecture by sort of that route of having a parent or father, certainly as an architect. But you can see then the bottom right is the kind of landscape that I sort of departed, sort of semi-rural Ohio. At that point, we'd moved out of the city to go to undergrad, if you go to the next slide. So I did my undergraduate, got a Bachelor of Science, a 4-year degree at Ohio State, which is in the top right. They just built this building in 2003, or 2004, actually, it was completed. And so I was lucky to have this brand new building to study undergraduate. It was completely alienating, challenging. Also, you know, both undergraduate and then graduate on the bottom left, where I went straight after that with all of my energy and ambition to Yale University for a Master's of Architecture, were pretty white spaces, both at the time and continue to be. So both the profession, the sort of discipline of architecture, or at Ohio State, it was in the engineering school, and the discipline and academic space was pretty kind of foreign to me. And I was really kind of finding my way through that. But luckily had just a few people who sort of pointed me in the right direction, professors. So if you continue. While I was at Yale, I had done internships back in Akron, changing the light bulbs, Xeroxing floor plans, and then did some more internships once I got to graduate school abroad. So I worked in that office there on the top left for OMA, which is a pretty major sort of design firm, international, that designed the middle building in Beijing, which at the time was a big deal. It was being completed when I was there. And just kind of getting exposure to this like hyper urban, very international design world, kind of by accident, if you go next. And then sort of, again, by happenstance, seeing a book on a professor's desk while I was working for them right after graduate school by this guy on the left. His name is Bernard Tschumi, who you will learn about, probably. I got a job at his office in New York, which is kind of like your, I would say, almost stereotypical solo genius architect office. But these are the sorts of things I was working on. I was hired to work on a large master plan in the Dominican Republic that you see there, that I'm kind of happy was not built, or doesn't seem like it will be built. And then the last thing I was working on when I left 7 years later, so I spent quite a bit of time there, which gets us to closer to the present, was a large campus south of Paris. So really working now, continuing this kind of international exposure to really projects at that scale and that kind of arena. If you go next. And so during that time, also Bernard is very famously part of academia. So during the 7 years while working at Bernard Tschumi Architects as a designer, eventually I kind of expressed interest and showed perhaps, I guess, promise or capacity to, in his eyes, to help him teach. So for 4 of those years, I was his assistant as he taught his studios at Columbia University. And then, while I was there, I was also moonlighting, which is kind of doing on weekends and nights, doing design work with my would-be business partner. So you can see we really started our design practice while we were working at other places, building public art, public installations that you see here. The one on the left was the first one we built, which was a competition. You can see us building it there on that small image. And on the right, this was a few years later, about 5 years ago in Harlem. If you go next, almost done. And then, now if we fast forward to today, that's sort of grown into a kind of practice where we continue to then sort of increase the scale of project that we take on and kind of put out there into the world to do. But it's a little bit, kind of a mixing of really looking for kind of public clients and in places that do not typically, the sort of cool New York firm typically goes to. I would say usually people do like rich people's houses as at my kind of type of office. And we've really tried to sort of find a different clientele. So this is a project on the bottom, on the right-hand side, a competition for Cleveland that Killian was involved with for a housing project for a sort of accessible living that we just won last year. If you go next. And so this is just, we can talk about this later, but kind of a diagram I did for all of you that sort of, very quickly maps out kind of the sort of many things, sort of similar to what Vanessa was saying, that kind of are involved in my practice, and really how for us and in my sort of official practice, academia, we've really tried to kind of have a kind of leaky relationship between sort of research that's happening in school or projects that might come out of a studio that's done it in the office, like some writing that I've done for things like the Harlem African Burial Ground, slowly start to make their way into projects in the office or kind of related projects in the office. So that's kind of where we are now, and that's my studio space on the top right. That's me. I think that's it.
Thank you.
That was great, thank you. So, hi everyone. It's a little disconcerting. So many of you have your cameras off. I would love to see your faces if you're willing to share what you look like. So it doesn't feel like we're just sort of talking out to these gray boxes. But we really appreciate being here and being able to share a little bit of our paths with you. I'm Jennifer Newsom. I'm an assistant professor in architecture at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And I also have a practice called Dream the Combine. If you go to the next slide. So we've all been kind of talking about our paths here is just kind of like a quick introduction to who we are. And so this is the kind of, if you look at my resume, this is what you're going to see, right? Like, well, preceding this, I went to a kind of college prep school here in Minnesota, actually, that my kids now also go to. Didn't know any architects growing up, but knew that I wanted to study architecture by the time I got to Yale College. And this was a kind of, the image here is a sort of very early project that I did. It was literally my first kind of real architecture studio that I was a part of. This very sort of, abstracted form that was about making a chimney, a bridge, and a stair, and connecting those in a single volume. But then from graduating as a architectural student at Yale College, I immediately went and worked for Robert A.M. Stern in New York. I was working in the model shop like most people who are just starting out in that office. And so I had, a nice little like blue smock that I would wear, and I would make these really big models of projects. And this is the Comcast Tower in Philly. And then after I was at Robert A.M. Stern's office, I actually went back to Yale. So Jerome and I did not overlap. I actually was teaching there when Jerome was a student. But went back to Yale, and honestly, the way that I ended up going back to Yale when I did was because I ruptured my Achilles tendon playing basketball. And so I decided, well, I thought I was going to take 2 years off, but maybe now I'll only take 1 year since I'm bedridden and can only sit here and work on my portfolio. So I decided to go back a little bit earlier. Also, when I was a student at Yale, I was also an athlete. So I was involved in track and field pretty heavily all 4 years that I was there. And didn't play basketball at all because I knew I could get injured. And so then once I was working in a firm and playing basketball again, of course, I get injured like the first game that I'm playing. But it brought me back to Yale, oddly enough, where I was pretty much trained in the kind of, like Western European modernist tradition that Yale excels at, even as they describe it as a kind of pluralistic environment. But while I was there, really struggled with like, how do I find my place in this space? I had some pretty discouraging encounters with a couple of professors there that made it clear that they didn't think I was supposed to be there, even though this was something that I wanted to do ever since I was a little kid. But made it through that program, and then ended up working actually at, I changed these, but these are in the wrong order. While I was a student at Yale, I ended up actually working for Ajay Associates in London, which was probably the first time that I really felt like I had kind of found my professional home. You know, it was a really international office. I was working in London. All different types of people were there working on projects at a variety of scales, from the kind of intimate, more residential scale to a museum project in Denver. So it was a really fantastic experience that I had there. But after I graduated, I ended up working in New York at Cooper Robertson, again, kind of in the typical vein of you know, working on fancy things for very fancy rich people. So that image is of a spa that we designed in the Caribbean. Ended up not getting built, which is probably a blessing. But then also worked for Deborah Burke's firm in New York also. And you know, did a kind of mixture there as well of high-end residential projects, some institutional projects in New York. All of this is before I kind of started my own practice. So next slide. This is a kind of, you know, resume version of my life, which I feel like only tells one part of the story, the kind of like Instagram ready part of the story. And I think the reality is in fact much messier. If you go to the next slide. So this is where I kind of started. This is my desk from my undergraduate studies at Yale, which is hard to believe that that was 20 years ago now. There's probably lots of things in this image that folks your age don't recognize. Like on the seat, there's a case full of CDs. There's a May line there. You know, all sorts of things that probably are obsolete right now. But I feel like this is really where the work is, in the messy spaces, you know, at your desk, facing yourself and the issue that's at hand. I think there'll, you know, you guys are all of you are starting on your journey this semester. And there are going to be lots of times when you're sitting at your desk kind of looking at your own desk, your own workspace, puzzling through the things that are on its surface and wondering, where do you find yourself in all of this? And so for me, it was really important in the context of this conversation to think back onto, like, what pieces of myself am I bringing to the task? Next slide. So recently I was asked to answer these two questions as part of a compilation of artists, architects, and designers that were assembled by Virgil Abloh for an upcoming issue of Garage magazine. And so even before I knew that I wanted to be an architect, or even knew what an architect was, and knew that I wanted to go to Yale, I thought that these questions were really provocative to get me thinking about, like, what really is my earliest spatial memory? And also, I was asked, you know, what does black space mean to you? So I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from what I wrote. My earliest, and I encourage you to think about what your earliest spatial memory is in this context. My earliest architectural memory is of me laying underneath the dining room table at 8 years old, drawing my own design for a house on one of my father's legal pads. The house was circular in plan and had a courtyard at the center with trees and tropical plants in the center. Wedge-shaped rooms surrounded the courtyard and made adding furniture difficult. But it was a space of my own imagining, and drawing it was a projective act that held great freedom. I think often about this single piece of paper, wishing I could find it somehow. I don't dare recreate the drawn house from memory because I know I'll never get it right. I'd need to recreate the whole scene, the blankets draped over the dining table to enclose my creative space like a fortress, the fresh legal pad extracted from Dad's brown leather briefcase, the sounds and smells of my parents cooking dinner in the kitchen, and the dim incandescent lighting, and my knees digging into the rough carpet, dreaming up the spaces that cradle a life like mine. So I knew that I wanted to be an architect ever since really that time, ever since I made that drawing, ever since I was 8. And in thinking about what does black space mean to me, I think about my grandmother who actually lived not too far away from where Tuskegee is. My family's from Montgomery, Alabama. And she used to have this big basket of photographs. And every time we'd go to her house for Thanksgiving, I would look through these pictures. The images of kind of black life and the black spaces that held them. Girls and boys in formal clothes drinking punch at a birthday party in my grandparents' basement. My grandfather holding up his catch triumphantly after fishing with my uncle at a lake. My cousins singing, "I believe the children are our future," in their high voices, mouths stretched. The photographs brought all these instances, some of which I directly experienced, but many that were before my time, back to life. So for me, Black space means any landscape, city, home, or intimate environment that is created by or occupied by Black people. The people come first and remake any container. Black space is Christmas morning in my childhood home in Florida. Black space is the back terrace of our house in Connecticut. Black space is folks around a dining room table playing a game of cards that's as serious as a heart attack, a towel under the card holder to protect the table's finish. Black space is the pine trees my father and I planted in the garden full of strawberries that we tended. Black space is being created all the time. Black space is just being in time. Black space is too now my own basket of photos that I share with my children. So I have a practice called Dream the Combine with my partner, and when we meet, next slide please. When we meet next week, actually, I'll be kind of talking with you further about my practice. I really am interested in these kind of people, subjective spaces, the ways in which human perception, specifically vision and movement, cause us to consider our relationships to one another. Next slide, please. And so for me, it's always coming back to people, especially Black people, are at the center. And so a lot of my work is kind of bound up in these conversations about surface, support, and the mechanisms of vision and movement that allow us to kind of read race, to read each other, to read environments, to understand space. So I'll talk more about that next week, but it's really a pleasure to meet all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. And all I'll say is that Jennifer's PS1 Pavilion is probably one of my favorite ones ever of that kind. It was just a beautiful, beautiful piece. My name is Killian Riano. I am very happy to be here with you guys, especially as you start out your architectural education, and with this group of people is incredible. Just a little bit about myself. I was born in Bogota, Colombia. I moved here when I was about 10 years old, and I moved to the city of Hialeah, a lower income / working class community in Miami. And one of the things that I remember from very early on was kind of living in Miami, in a city that's car culture centric, really feeling the lack of public spaces, sidewalks, that those sets of things that sometimes bring people together into a community just did not exist. I moved from Hialeah to South Dakota through the Air Force. I was stationed in Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, but it ended up being one of the most influential things that happened to me, because while I was there, actually one of the last things I did while I was finishing my 4-year tour and wondering whether I was gonna go into art or architecture, I worked with an African-American colonel that was part of the Red Horse team, the engineering team of the Air Force. And we were actually, my job was to buy things. So I was just buying things for him. He was the actual engineer. He had the knowledge. But we were working with the Native reservation in South Dakota, building wells. And obviously the political, and at the same time, I had an American Indian movement AIM professor of sociology, a radical professor, who really helped me contextualize what we were doing, the power dynamics, the social dynamics, and the reality that that things are built in a certain way for a reason. So it made me want to be one of the people that gets to work on how things are built. Then it took me back to Florida, University of Florida, where I went and got my undergraduate. Then I worked in Architecture 2030, a nonprofit, and then Harvard University. But through it all, the idea of who is public and what is public became one of the most important things. So my story is a little bit about sharing with you about my practice as more arts-based, to be quite honestly, architectural-based, but arts-based and urbanism, but also working within a university in a community design center. So I moved to New York City about 12 years ago, right before Occupy Wall Street was about to start. And that changed my practice. It was very involved, mapping, understanding the structures, understanding what privatization and public space actually mean, creating maps for occupation, even working with organizing groups. That led me to try to seek tools that better communicate and democratize what we do as architects. So I ended up working a lot in a place called Corona in Queens, the borough of Queens, and got into something called Theater of the Oppressed. Some of these things I'm gonna talk a little bit more. So what I decided to do is start creating games, and that creation of games as a way to co-create and share the knowledge that we have as architects with broader, and not just share, but literally learn, listen, to be careful about the ways and the things you do. And then in studios, bringing this to studios. So this is a game that we made similar to Monopoly that explains urban policy. In this case, we're playing it with undocumented street vendors in this area, trying to reimagine urban policy with them. And then down here in Ottawa, in Carleton University, I brought students from Canada, and we build similar games, but now to create and build space. The same set of ideas around games and how to build them, it also led me to apply them into, in this case, this is a project in Nicaragua. A community reached out to a few of us, and this was a collaborative project including architect Teddy Cruz, well known for his work in Latin America and in socially engaged. But we were working in a place where it was hard to get two things. Number one, an actual survey where the trees were. Number two, the trees are very important. We didn't want to knock them down. And number three, quite honestly, a lot of people didn't know how to read plans. So instead of creating a typical plan, we created a game. A plan for an urban game, so map out the trees, and everything was gamified so that it could then begin to be built by people on the ground with their own agency. And also we began to create opportunities for people to collectivize, to come together and create, and that way have more land and grow more tamarindo trees or whatever it was. With the same kind of idea around gaming, this is a project in Dallas, and this is where I'm gonna be chatting a little bit about the role of arts institutions. This was an arts conference in Dallas about the future of the Sun Belt city. And they asked me to build something small for the community. So instead of an art piece or anything like that, I decided to create this as a sandbox, but it literally is a sandbox in which you use these yellow sticks here to reimagine what happens inside of it. And this back here is a series of dew catchers. So the game really is to negotiate land and water. So that is the future of the Southwestern city. So without being too didactic, by allowing it to be playful, really getting at the heart of the conversations and including everyone in this community and at all ages. So I'm gonna chat a little bit about a few other projects around public space that I have created, mostly working in Black and Brown communities all over the United States. A farm in South Phoenix, under the elevated new kind of public space in New York City in Sunset Park. This is a farm that is opening in Richmond, Virginia next month. I've been working with artist Duran Chavez, who is a radical urban farmer who centers Black space around the work that he does. And then I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about a community design center. A community design center is a group within a university that works with communities. In the case, I work for the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, which is part of Kent State University. And right now, I'm very much interested in working on cooperatives. One of the things that this kind of setup allows me to do is both get into the design of public spaces, urban spaces, but also into larger issues. As some of you might know, this area has had tons of job loss over the last many years. This is what it used to be, and there are new ideas around collective and cooperative actions which have the potential to minimize the racial wealth gap and community wealth building. And this is going to be some of the things that we're going to talk about. And this specifically is Warren, Ohio. So the Woo sign that you hear is actually for Warren, and Youngstown, Ohio.
Ohio.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Killian, and everybody, really. So again, I'm Justin Garrett Moore. So my kind of career path has taken a lot of different threads. And so I'm going to talk about two of the major tracks. One, my work as an architect and designer working in New York City government, and then with work that I've done individually with my social enterprise urban path. So my background in education is I did also undergraduate University of Florida, so Bachelor of Design, that's a 4-year architecture degree. Then I went on to grad school at Columbia University where I did a dual degree, so a Master of Architecture, the professional architecture degree, but then I also did a Master's of Urban Design. And so urban design is another type of built environment field that if you have interest in cities or community development or just larger scales or different types of design strategies, urban design is a branch of architecture and design practice that you can also get education in and practice. So my career in built environment fields goes back 25 years. I'm 40 years old, so I started at 15. I'll talk about that in a second. But most of my professional career, so after my formal education, has been a designer working in government. And so it's not a traditional career path that people think about necessarily working in government, but in New York City government, there are over 1,000 designers working directly for the city. So not at a firm, not at a practice, not in a construction company, but working directly for the people, right? Kamala Harris for the people, right? So for the people is a job and career path. I've also, in the past decade or so, done my own built environment social enterprise called Urban Patch. And all of this is really just to say that you can have a lot of different hats. I have multiple hats working in urban planning and design development, but also in the private sector, the public sector, nonprofit, and in education. And then I also have obviously the credentials. You'll hear about this probably from Vanessa. So AICP is the urban planner credential, but I'm also a part of NOMA, National Organization of Minority Architects, and lead AP. Wait, do I have the controls still? Yeah. So I wanted to start by saying that the 25 years was that 25 years ago when I was 15 years old, my high school, and this is my high school gym, was being rebuilt, and there was a gymnasium addition. So when I was 15 years old, I got to work in the architecture firm that designed and kind of project managed the construction of our new gymnasium. So even as a kid, I had this really great early exposure into architecture and construction because I learned that summer about all the different things that people do in architecture. So yes, there are the designers just doing the renderings and the presentations, but then there are the construction managers that are making sure the thing gets built properly and on budget. There are the people in the engineering and mechanical engineering that are making sure that the air conditioning is going to work for this facility, right? So there are a lot of different things that you can do with built environment design education. But as I mentioned, my own career track was really looking at the larger scales and the urban scales. It's just where my natural interests lied. I care a lot about social issues. I care a lot about cities and communities. And so most of my career has been working at the urban scale of architecture, construction, and design. So this image is of, in the foreground, it's Hunters Point South. This is a big 30-acre city redevelopment project in New York, 5,000 units of affordable housing, 10 acres of new waterfront park, infrastructure, all of that. But in kind of the background are, frankly, all the different projects I've worked on over the years. So working in master plans, community developments, rezonings, kind of waterfront open space design that I've worked on across the years. But in this image, you see lots of different scales of design. The scale of design that connects to how people experience spaces, but also scale development of the city. And so that happens in a lot of different ways. I work in currently the New York City Public Design Commission. So we're a design review agency. So we talk about the design of individual sites in the city, but also kind of working with architects and designers directly. So this project, the Peninsula in the South Bronx, actually has a Black architect, Victor Bodie Lawson, and a Black landscape architect, Elizabeth Kennedy, that worked on this project. So this is kind of revitalizing parts of our city in new ways. I'm trying to go to the next slide. So this is kind of a shift, and the other conversation I've done is personal work. So I've also been engaged in work in other contexts. So this is a video talking about the production of bricks. So Tuskegee, you have your history and legacy of not just design, but also of construction and everything that we have to take responsibility for when it comes to design and construction. So that's down to the materials, down to questions about labor, about natural resources, even about carbon emissions, right? So what are ways that you can kind of responsibly deal with labor, use green materials, create green jobs? These are also considerations that we have to think about and talk about in design and construction, and also kind of build the networks, the expertise, the different kinds of knowledge bases that we need to kind of to put together and to assemble buildings, right? So this image is from a group called SCAT Consulting. So they do kind of technical assistance around urban development and construction in East Africa. And so my company, Urban Patch, sorry, my slides are not advanced. So my company, Urban Patch, has been doing development, design, and construction in Rwanda, East Africa. So this is where I'm serving as the urban planner to figure out where to build a site, as the architect to design the building and the layout and the elevation, and the construction manager to make sure that the thing gets built on time and using all these different types of resources. And so this shows kind of many different aspects of design that we do, kind of from the scale of procuring the bricks, right? The white bricks in this image were procured from a woman-owned brick making factory, right, for social equity and gender equity, through to the design of just making sure the elevation looks cool, right? So that's me. So with that, we're ready for your questions.
And it might be a little bit like, you know, like drinking from the fire hose. So we get, but at the same time, I'm also sort of envious of your position. Like, man, if somebody would have come to me and showed me 5 different, like very different architects, maybe my path might be a little different. Hi, David. He's one of my really good friends from college, actually. Any questions from any of you all?
I have a question.
Yes.
My name is Carby Jean. I'm a 4th-year architecture student. I'm the current NOMA's president for Tuskegee University. And my background is in Haiti. And analyzing his presentation, he had mentioned a lot about urbanism, right? And then I would say in Haiti or in other African countries, you know, urbanism was the focus of some architects to you know, to make the roads were used as roads because, of course, the flea markets, people would go all around and stuff like that. And what would you say about that aspect, like the you know, when you look at a flea market, you see community, you see people talking to each other, communing with each other and everything like that. Would you say that that would need to change, or there would be, like, there needs to be a design that changes that, or do you think that's okay with the way that it is?
So I don't know if anyone saw Black Panther. So Hannah Beachler, a production designer, she's not an architect, but she's a person that is in the business of like envisioning space and interactions with people. So the reason I mention that is in that movie, there are scenes where they're in the Golden City and kind of how the city and its spaces are conceived are just entirely different from a lot of the references that we're given, right? So how mobility with public transportation works, that it was a more pedestrian priority space. There were kind of market and exchange and bazaar type spaces while still kind of accomplishing density, right? And when you go to other parts of the world, that is a condition that exists, right? That's not the condition that we see a lot here in the US, or even that a lot of companies and governments and everything encourage, because there's this sort of engine of capital and flow and quote unquote efficiency that is given priority over people and over environment, right? The two go together. And so I think that's our work, right? All of you, especially the next generation, to really push and to challenge that, right? What makes a good urban space? What makes a functional urban space? What makes a desirable urban space? And how do you build it, right? So that's what we're all in the business of doing in some form or another. And I think you're picking up something great, which is to kind of challenge when you see things that have value, and to kind of push back and say, well, how do we design or how do we build to maintain the kind of sense of community, the type of culture, the types of interactions that we want to see, right? And that takes a lot of different kinds of skills. That takes technical skills to figure out, well, traffic still has to move, so how are you going to solve that problem? Or, you know, the space still has to be cleaned and maintained so that it's a healthy environment. You know, how do we do that? With, you know, so there are a lot of different things that you'll be learning as designers, and then ultimately in practice continuing to learn that hopefully get at some of those issues. But it's something that we absolutely are here to kind of care about and to help elevate those concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Any others? And it would be cool if you can turn cameras on for, I know I hate being on camera too. I'm a shy person, but it's nice to see you all. Hi, Jarn and Naya. Thank you. Any other questions?
Don't be shy, guys.
Yeah.
We've all been in your shoes.
They're just all on mute.
I think another thing that maybe might work is if you have, I know that we all sort of talked sort of pretty fast about lots of different things. So I don't know if, Roderick, are you gonna allow, is the recording gonna be available for them? Because maybe if you get a chance to relook at this or sort of think of questions, you know, you can always email them, you know, you put them together, you can email them, and, or, you know, the next time, you know, Jennifer will be going the next session, but we'll all be sort of rotating in and out, so you can sort of get your questions ready for when we're going to be there.
Yeah, and we can share the presentation deck as well.
Can they, Roderick, can they chat, the students in the chat?
Yes, they should be able to do that. So
Okay, so that's another way to ask a slightly more shy question.
yeah, you can just
Yes, yeah, you can use the chat.
I've already gotten a question about the role architecture in the Air Force.
You gonna answer it, Killian?
Oh, well, what I share, and the thing is, Samuel, it sounds like he couldn't hear earlier, some connectivity issues. So I was just saying that in the Air Force, there's a few ways, and number one is that there is that Red Horse team that I was talking about. The Navy has the Seabees, famously. The Army has the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Air Force has the Red Horse team. And that is a way to potentially, and they do the kind of thing that a military building unit does, which is build bridges, build sometimes fake towns. But in the case of what I was sharing with you guys, we were building wells for communities that needed them, that had never had a working kind of water system. But in other ways, that architecture opens up your path to strategic jobs in multiple places. Quite honestly, not all people that study architecture end up in architecture. And architecture is now being taught at, the Harvard Business School. The Harvard Business School and the Harvard Design School now have paths. But because the way that architecture is taught and the architectural thinking allows you to open up into strategic, so intelligence, and quite honestly, one of the jobs that people seem to love is PR or whatever that's called in the military. I already forgot. But any one of those sets of jobs that require strategic thinking, I think architecture is a really good set of skills that you'll bring to.
We have a question about internships. What was the internship process like? So maybe we could all comment on that, but then also, do you all offer internships? Which I think is a good question. I for one would be happy to at least, be in touch and maybe get a list of the students from this class. We're in a really interesting moment that's completely different than when any of us were 18, 19, 20 years old. I actually had an image in my slideshow of my office now, which I have a fake image of my office behind me. But now my office are me, my business partner, and our two interns Zooming together. So, I think the landscape for things like internships is a little bit different right now, but that can be both good and bad. My first internship was, gosh, how did I even get it? I think it was in my hometown. It was in Akron. And I think that there was a career fair at Ohio State at the School of Architecture. And I want to say they came and I just gave them my resume. So it was very kind of typical. But I remember just asking anyone that I knew, because no one in my family was an architect. So I was just asking friends of the family, do you know an architect who wants to hire me? And, that was my first couple of internships, was just asking people if they knew architects.
Yeah. Yeah, I had, like I said, I had kind of a lucky path into internship because there was a particular program that the firms were hiring students as the firm did projects on the school. But the thing I would speak about on internships is that, once the opportunity is created, you do have to be sort of like a really active participant and be very curious once you land in a firm, whether it's a larger firm or a smaller firm, to make sure that you get the exposure to all the different aspects of the built environment or design or architecture or construction world, because you'll learn there are just so many different things that people do, and we're all different and we're all good at different things, right? So there are people that they're really great communicators, right? It takes a lot of great communication to get something as complex as a building built, right? And so there are people that tend to do more of that type of work. There are some people that are incredibly technical, right? They know all of the kind of the specifications, and they are kind of constantly learning about the best new way to build something or what the best materials are, right? And that's a different kind of knowledge base. So definitely once you kind of find firms and offices that may have opportunities, once you're in a place, it's very important to, as an individual, to make sure that you're kind of not a passive kind of, okay, I guess I'll make the copies now, or, or kind of whatever the roles are, but that you're kind of making the connections with different kinds of people in the firms to learn about it. The other piece that's important is to start to build your kind of mentorship networks. Once you're in an office, or obviously while you're in school, but to sort of be able to reach out and ask people for kind of connections, or kind of how do they go about making their way through their careers.
Yeah, I think so many opportunities that I've had in my life have come from the power of like good letter writing. So I really appreciate the enterprising nature of the question of like, what was the process like, and do you all offer any? You know, just be bold and ask for what you want, ask for what you need. I think Justin's really right that part of the internship process is that you have to kind of advocate for the types of experience that you want to get. You know, back when I was doing it, it was like, okay, you know, you have a certain number of hours in all of these different categories if you're working towards licensure. And so those don't necessarily align with what's going on at the firm at that time. So you really have to be, I think, kind of nimble about navigating your way through and thinking through what kinds of experience do you need. But that's, I would say, you know, strictly kind of if I'm thinking about moving towards licensure. But I would also point out that, you know, I've had other jobs that weren't in architecture that actually gave me a lot of skills and, you know, really incredible experiences that then impacted what I am most interested in, passionate about, good at now in my architecture practice. My first kind of real job was working actually while I was still, I think it was after my senior year of high school. I was part of of Inroads, which is like a kind of internship program for students of color. And I worked at Procter and Gamble. And so I'm working at this huge, you know, like multinational corporation, but, you know, working in customer business development. So a lot of it was like persuasive selling. How do you sell and how do you, you know, compel people with your ideas? Things that are very applicable to a design practice. You know, you have to build consensus. You have to get people on board with the direction of a project. So all of those skills come to bear. And so that wasn't something that I necessarily learned in an architecture firm, but I got from other kinds of professional experience that I had.
Yeah,
Oh,
go ahead, Killian.
No, I would just echo that. Especially, I think Jerome and Jennifer have both made the point that sometimes, and that one place also to look at is potential nonprofits. Like, for example, one thing that, again, that changed for me, when Architecture 2030, which now is one of the biggest nonprofits within architecture, focused on climate change and the environment, started by a guy named Ed Masria, who has been doing this since the 70s. Like, he wrote the book of passive solar energy book, etc. So I started in his firm, and he was starting a nonprofit, and I decided to stay. I was about to leave. I was an intern. I decided to stay because I thought it was an interesting story, and then maybe a little bit like Jennifer, I was thinking of actually the opposite, going to school right away, and decided to take some time off. But that experience in kind of with the nonprofit and the way it worked and the way it tried to get its message out and create coalitions and etc. really changed the way I would practice, both in the design, but also things even that have led maybe even to something like this, like Dark Matter University.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, you know, I was a camp counselor for 2 years out of when I was going into undergrad, and then my first year in undergrad, I went back, and I still think I learned some amazing team management, social skills doing that. You know, and also I think the advice I would give myself back then would echo Jennifer's, which is to be bold and, you know that you're not bothering people as much as you may think you are. Yeah. And I think that's lifelong advice. I still have to give myself that advice. And sometimes to ask twice. I mean, you know, especially today, I get probably 100 emails a day, and I might miss somebody who wants an internship at my office the first time. And it's not even it's not no fault of theirs or whatever. It's that I just got buried in the emails. So if you want something, you go for it. I remember I really wanted to work it was one of what I felt to be more international firms in Columbus, Ohio, when I was a student at Ohio State. And I hounded down one of the principals there and I tried to meet with him. I would send him my portfolio, and the first, year went by and he looked at it and he was like, well, maybe not this year. And I was kind of, you know, down about it. But then the next summer I sent it to him again and he said, oh, your portfolio's gotten so much better and we have a place for you this summer. So it might take a year, it might take 2 years. So, you know, persistence is the name of the game.
Yeah, and I would say if there's specific building types or specific firms that you're really interested in, start getting involved with those groups, or maybe put Google alerts, you know, on your phone specifically for internships or specifically to the firm, so that you can just find out what they're working on, what types of projects they have, or what news they have. So that way you can do sort of informational check-ins and say, hey, you know, I saw you got this project. You know, so sort of start tracking some of the firms that you might be interested in. Because I always found that it's more, if you have a personal connection or a personal reason why you want to work in a specific firm, you have a lot more of a shot than just, you know, anybody hiring, right? So, because you really want to align sort of your work with firms that have sort of a shared set of values. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And since you all are more kind of starting your education and kind of career in architecture, to really be curious and just spend a lot of time looking at different firms and offices. So for those of you that don't know it, ArchConnect, I mean, there are multiple websites, but you can look at and kind of browse these firms and companies, look at the types of projects they're doing. It could be looking at the firms that are in your city where you're already located, or if you're interested in another city, you know, to really just spend a lot of time getting to learn the firms and the work and see what interests you. And that is, I totally agree with that point. Some people get into architecture because they really care about housing, or they want to do schools and museums and cultural institutions, right? Firms do different kinds of work. And so it's important to kind of find the place that is going to have the things that interest you as well.
I'm just going to chime in. I know we're probably over time, but Morgan, you brought up really, really good point there. And I want to sort of slightly address it in that I was in New York City, you know, during Hurricane Sandy, and there's a lot of other similar plans that were happening in New York City. And I think the question of how money is spent and how communities are engaged or not engaged in the sort of the recovery process is really important. I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be right now in that process. And I know Justin's probably been involved in some of these other efforts as well. And maybe, you know, in one of our presentations, we can touch on that a little bit more. But there's lots of advocacy efforts underway to really look at how these processes can happen in a more just way.
Yeah, really good question. So this is where we have to have more complete conversations about all of the players and actors that the field requires. So, you know, architecture is a point of entry for a lot of people, but Killian was mentioning this, people end up doing different things. So a lot of people end up in urban planning, or in policy, or in infrastructure, or community development, right? Lots of different fields that design education, design background can be a really important kind of ingredient to having better outcomes. And so this idea of the kind of the Dutch firm coming in because white people in Europe have the answer, and then just, you know, landing them in New Jersey, you know, there are a lot of challenges because they didn't know and understand all the different kind of issues of those communities in consideration. And so, you know, there are a lot of different ways that I think people are learning that kind of imported approach doesn't always work, and that, you know, kind of pairing people and pairing firms and organizations in ways that we can get a more intelligent and more respectful and responsive design result is something that people really are pushing for. But it may be that if you're looking at those kind of scales of development design, you need to understand the engineering firms, right, that are contracted to look at things like hydrology and, you know, the scientists that are, you know, doing climate adaptation models were things that the engineers were really good at talking to those climate scientists, but the architects weren't so good at it, right? And so that's where the kind of the architects and designers needed to kind of bring on other skills and have, you know, break down some of the silos that exist for what your exposure and knowledge are. So if you're interested in those type of issues and topics, you may want to look at the firms that have those different kinds of skill sets. So they've got an engineering branch as well as landscape architecture, for example. But absolutely, it's a really important point, and you know, we generally just have to do a much better job at getting all the different what we call built environment disciplines to kind of work together in a more integrated way to get better outcomes for our neighborhoods.
This has been a great session.
Also, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I know we've gone over time. I want to thank the students for hanging in, and for those who just asked questions and so forth. Really, really good. We'll continue. We're going to pick up, I believe, next week with Jennifer, and we have a schedule. So each of them will kind of come back individually and be with us. So just thank you. We realized we went over time, but I think it was well worth it, and glad to get the additional comments from the presenters today. So I guess with that, we'll just say we'll see you for now, and look forward to your next visit.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
And have a good rest of your week too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Cheers.